On the 31st of August, 2025, South Africa suddenly became the center of international media attention, all revolving around the shocking moves of U.S. President Donald Trump. Trump announced that the United States has suspended aid to South Africa after its newly approved land reform. In an interesting twist, just days later, the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, declared a new land law. According to reports, Traoré announced that all land in the country now belongs to the government. Some critics called this dictatorial, but the authorities in Burkina Faso emphasized there is a reason behind the reform. So what is the reason? And how will it impact farmers, businesses, and foreign interests? Let's find out. On the 1st of September, the Council of Ministers approved a bill that reshaped land ownership in Burkina Faso. The meeting, attended by President Traoré, was led by Economic Minister Abubakar Nakanabo. He made the bill official. According to him, the legal text enshrines a new objective of the state: to optimize land management, and to strengthen the central role of public authorities in this strategic sector. In simple terms, the government has now taken ownership of all land in the country. For decades, land ownership in Burkina Faso was based on customary rights. Communities controlled and allocated land according to traditional norms. Families passed it down through generations. People felt secure over the land they lived on. But this system had challenges: frake dispute, lack of clear documentation, and exploitation by powerful elites. The new law changes that. Ownership passes to the government. The state can now issue regulatory acts to grant land management to local authorities. The reform introduces long-term leases, ranging from 18 to 99 years, for agriculture and development purposes. But what exactly is Traoré's plan? Before we continue, a quick reminder: like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so you can get more updates like this. As you know, President Traoré is deeply patriotic. He is committed to protecting Burkina Faso's sovereignty. And this is why one of the key provisions of the new land bill is the restriction of foreigners from acquiring property titles. This is huge. In Africa, it is common to see foreign companies and individuals buying up land. But in Burkina Faso, that era may be over. Foreign multinational companies have long acquired vast tracts of land in Africa. This phenomenon, known as land grabbing, exists because Africa is rich in natural resources, fertile lands, and weak land rights protections for local people. Host countries often provide generous investment incentives, making the problem even worse. Most of the time, these lands are used to grow food and crops for export. Recently, 25 million hectares of land in 5 African countries were snapped up by Blue Carbon, a Gulf-based firm that brokers carbon offsets. This land represents 10% of Liberia's surface area and 20% of Zimbabwe's. After the 2007-2011 global financial crisis, food prices spiked and food security became urgent. Prime farmland across Africa was quickly seized by agribusinesses, sovereign wealth funds, and financial speculators. Europeans were shocked when it was revealed that a Dutch bank, a German coffee roaster, and a Swedish bioenergy firm were all implicated in land grabs that forced African farmers and communities off their land. Even when the crisis eased, pressure on farmland never disappeared. Now, 15 years later, global land prices have doubled. Land grabbing is back with a vengeance, and farmers are being squeezed from every side. Reports warn that today's land squeeze is escalating dangerously in new forms. Carbon and biodiversity offset schemes, financial speculation, resource grabs, expanding mines, mega developments, and industrial food systems. The result is devastating. A new rush for land is displacing small-scale farmers, indigenous peoples, pastoralists, and rural communities. Their control over land is being stripped away. The consequences are dire, worsening poverty, hunger, and land inequality across the continent. The future of small-scale farming itself is at risk. This is why President Ibrahim Traoré made his move. By placing land under state ownership, he is cutting off one of the biggest avenues of exploitation. For decades, land mismanagement has plagued Burkina Faso. Large hectares remained unused and wasted. But with this reform, the government can now allocate land efficiently for large-scale agriculture, boosting food security. In addition, Burkina Faso has long faced conflicts between farmers and herders, as well as between indigenous people and migrants. With the new law with the state in control of land, President Traoré can now regulate distribution more accurately and reduce conflict. Finally, under state ownership, the government can push forward his goal of industrializing Burkina Faso. Roads, factories, and large projects can now be launched quickly, without bureaucratic delays or resistance from private landowners. This is remarkable. But how is Burkina Faso's land reform different from that of South Africa? In South Africa, the reform is driven mainly by the need to correct historical injustice. During the apartheid era, the black majority was oppressed in every possible way, including housing and land ownership. In 1913, the British colonial authorities passed the Natives' Land Act. It restricted property rights for black South Africans. The vast majority of land was placed under the control of the white minority. This act laid the foundation for the forced removal of black people into poor homelands and townships. This continued for decades, until the end of apartheid, only 30 years ago. According to the South African Parliament, local, provincial, and national authorities will now have the power to enforce the new law. They can acquire land for purposes such as infrastructure development, public services, and land reform. But the bill is clear. Expropriation cannot happen arbitrarily, or for reasons beyond serving the public good. The anger, according to U.S. President Donald Trump, is that South Africa is forcefully taking land from the white minority. However, the South African president has stated otherwise. South Africa, he insists, is a constitutional democracy, one rooted in justice, equality, and the rule of law. The expropriation law, he says, is not an instrument of confiscation, but a legal process mandated by the Constitution. It guarantees public access to land in a fair and just way. Burkina Faso, on the other hand, is taking a proactive economic approach. All land is centrally controlled by the state. But customary land rights are still recognized through rural possession certificates. Now let's turn to Zimbabwe. When South Africa announced its land reform, critics immediately pointed to Zimbabwe as a warning. For years, people have said Zimbabwe's economy collapsed in the 2002 because Robert Mugabe took land back from white farmers. But doesn't that story sound suspicious? Under British colonial rule, Africans in Rhodesia could not buy or occupy land freely. In 1930, the Land Apportionment Act was passed by the Southern Rhodesian legislature. It was approved by the British government in 1931. The act made it illegal for black Africans to own land outside of the so-called native reserves. These reserves covered only 22% of the country's least fertile land. Meanwhile, white settlers, just 4.9% of the population, gained access to 57% of the country's most fertile farmland. To put it in numbers, 50 million acres were allocated to around 48,000 white settlers, while 1 million black Africans were left to share just 20 million acres. As with most British colonial land grabs, African communities were forcibly removed from fertile areas. Their lands were handed over to new white settler communities. Cecil Rhodes himself once said, "It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory." More territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, the most human, the most honorable race the world possesses. Like many African nations, Rhodesia faced a long and violent struggle for liberation. One of the key leaders of this fight was Robert Mugabe, head of the largest African guerrilla army, standing against the white minority government. And like any African who dared to resist the West, Mugabe was branded a terrorist. He was accused of massacring his own people. Yet in the end, Mugabe and his movement won. Zimbabwe achieved independence. During the Lancaster House peace talks of 1979, Britain promised to fund Zimbabwe's land redistribution program. It provided £47 million in aid after independence. But that amount was far too little to finance real reform. Despite repeated appeals, Britain never fulfilled its pledge. In 1997, Claire Short, the UK's International Development Secretary, wrote to the Zimbabwean government. She declared that the new Labour government had no special responsibility to pay for land redistribution. Britain's refusal fueled anger in Zimbabwe. It became one of the driving forces behind the violent land seizures of the 2002. The Lancaster Agreement never returned the stolen land to the black majority. Instead, it introduced a willing buyer, willing seller system. This meant that the new government of Zimbabwe would have to buy the very land that had been stolen using British pounds or US dollars from the descendants of the colonial settlers. Imagine that. Not only did Africans have to buy back their own land, but the price was set by the very people who had stolen it. The value of land in Zimbabwe was never set by its rightful owners. It was determined by the white settler minority. At the time, nearly 95% of Zimbabwe's economy was under the control of Europeans and Americans. That meant poor black families who had fought for independence and who worked the land for generations were left powerless. They could not compete in a market designed to keep them out. Imagine being told to buy back your own stolen home at a price decided by the thief. That was the cruel reality of post-colonial Zimbabwe. Over time, anger built up. Frustration turned into desperation. War veterans, the same men and women who risked their lives in the liberation struggle, began occupying stolen lands. These included vast white-owned farms that stretched for miles. The Mugabe government, faced with this groundswell of action, had no choice. By the late 1992, it became clear that the so-called willing buyer, willing seller arrangement imposed by Britain was never going to work. Ordinary Zimbabweans were tired of waiting, and in June 2000, the government announced it would move forward with compulsory land seizures. But let us be clear, this was not a rash decision born out of chaos. It was Britain's refusal to honor its promises at the 1979 Lancaster House Agreement that forced the issue. For years, Zimbabwe pleaded with London to release the funds needed for land redistribution. Instead, in 1997, the British government under Clare Short openly declared it had no obligation to pay. That betrayal ignited a chain reaction. The people rose up, and the government, already under immense pressure, simply formalized what the population had already begun. The result was messy, rushed, and bitterly contested. It created a toxic political atmosphere that still lingers today. And yet, even in this chaos, one truth is often ignored. The United States and the European Union were not passive observers. They struck back with fury, and their response was devastating. In 2002, the European Union imposed a travel ban on key Zimbabwean officials. Assets were frozen. Trade agreements were cut off. Western governments justified these moves with lofty words: human rights abuses, undermining democracy. They called them targeted measures. But the truth was far darker. The sanctions devastated the economy. And then came Washington. In 2003, U.S. President George W. Bush escalated the pressure. He signed an executive order declaring Zimbabwe an extraordinary threat to the United States of America. Let that sink in. A small, landlocked African nation labeled a threat to the world's largest superpower. This was more than rhetoric. It was, according to experts, a declaration of economic war. Under Bush's declaration, a national emergency was announced. Washington had two choices: military intervention or economic sanctions. It chose sanctions, and these sanctions were absolute. No American company, no foreign firm operating under U.S. influence was allowed to do business with Zimbabwe. Overnight, Zimbabwe was cut off from global trade and credit. The impact was catastrophic. Foreign investment disappeared. Imports of fuel, machinery, and medicine dried up. Hospitals could not restock basic supplies. Factories shut down because they had no access to spare parts or raw materials. Schools closed as public funding collapsed. The once promising Zimbabwean economy was thrown into freefall. By the late 2002, the situation reached nightmare levels. Inflation spiraled beyond imagination. At its peak in 2007 and 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate reached a staggering 79.6 billion% per month. The Zimbabwean dollar became worthless paper. People carried wheelbarrows full of notes just to buy a loaf of bread. Bank accounts were emptied overnight. Pensions vanished. The middle class was destroyed. Unemployment soared above 80%. Teachers, doctors, engineers, once respected professionals were forced to flee the country or turn to informal street trading to survive. Families went hungry. Diseases spread as hospitals ran out of antibiotics and basic drugs. Life expectancy plummeted. And all the while, the narrative in Western media was carefully crafted. They told the world that Mugabe's reckless land reform had destroyed Zimbabwe. But what they rarely mentioned were the sanctions. Sanctions that strangled the economy. Sanctions that cut Zimbabwe off from global finance. Sanctions that made recovery impossible. It was not land reform alone that destroyed Zimbabwe. It was the deliberate policy of isolation imposed by Western powers, angry that an African nation had dared to reclaim its stolen land. The truth is this: land reform in Zimbabwe may have been chaotic. It may have been rushed. It may have been messy. But it was not the true cause of Zimbabwe's collapse. The real weapon that broke Zimbabwe was sanctions. The economic war waged by the West. It was the freezing of assets, the cutting off of trade, the isolation of an entire nation from the global financial system. That was what ruined Zimbabwe. And that is why this lesson is so important. Because it is not just history. It is a warning. A warning to Africa. A warning to every small nation that dares to rise. Whenever you take back what is yours, the old powers will come for you. Not always with guns. Not always with armies. But with sanctions. With financial warfare. With pressure designed to suffocate you slowly, until you surrender. This is the lesson that President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso has studied carefully. He has looked at Zimbabwe. He has looked at Libya. He has looked at every African nation that challenged the West and paid the price. And he has drawn one conclusion. Any African nation that dares to take back its resources will face the same response. Pressure, sanctions, isolation. The West will always dress it up in noble words. They will speak of democracy. They will speak of freedom. They will speak of human rights. But behind the mask of these noble words lies something else entirely. Behind the mask is a weapon of control. This is why Traoré has chosen a different path. He has built Burkina Faso's land reforms on a new foundation. Yes, there is state ownership. But there is also clear regulation. Yes, the state is in control. But customary land rights are recognized through rural possession certificates. Yes, foreign exploitation is blocked. But domestic farmers, cooperatives, and local businesses are strengthened. The goal is not to create chaos. The goal is to create order. To protect the people's land from being stolen again. To ensure that agriculture, food security, and natural resources serve Burkinabe citizens first, not multinational corporations, and not foreign powers. Most importantly, Traoré is not naive. He knows the backlash will come. He knows the West will not sit quietly. He knows there will be pressure, there will be sanctions, and there will be attempts at isolation. But unlike Zimbabwe in the 2002, Burkina Faso is not standing alone. This is the difference. Traoré is not just thinking of Burkina Faso. He is thinking of the Sahel. He is thinking of Africa. He is building alliances. In Mali, in Niger, in Guinea, in Chad. In every corner of the continent where leaders are tired of being dictated to by Washington, Paris, London, or Brussels. Unlike Zimbabwe 2 decades ago, Burkina Faso has friends. It has partners. It has an alliance of nations determined to reclaim sovereignty. These nations know the West's tactics. They know the costs. They know that sanctions are coming. But this time, they are ready to resist. The story of Zimbabwe is not simply about failure. It is about betrayal by former colonial powers. It is about resistance by a nation that refused to bow. It is about survival against impossible odds. And for leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, Zimbabwe's story is more than history. It is a handbook, a manual of what must be avoided and what must be confronted. A reminder that if you bow, you remain enslaved. But if you resist, you must be prepared to pay the price. Whenever Africa dares to rise, the old powers respond with fear. They unleash propaganda. They unleash sanctions. They try to turn allies into enemies. They try to break the will of the people. But this time, Africa is not afraid. This time, Africa is not alone. This time, The leaders of the Sahel are building something new. A new alliance. A new sovereignty. A new chapter in history. Burkina Faso is no longer a small, weak country at the mercy of outsiders. It is becoming a symbol, a rallying point, a spark that has the power to ignite a fire across the continent. And Ibrahim Traoré, a man once dismissed as too young, too inexperienced, is proving something extraordinary. That courage, clarity, and conviction can be stronger than billions in foreign aid. That sovereignty, once claimed, can inspire millions beyond one nation's borders. The world's old powers are watching closely. They are worried, because for the first time in decades, Africa is not begging. It is not pleading. It is demanding. It is standing. It is ready. Zimbabwe's pain was real, but its lesson may yet save a new generation of nations, because Africa remembers, and Africa refuses to repeat the same mistakes. Burkina Faso has chosen a harder path, but it is also the braver one, the path of dignity, the path of sovereignty, the path of resistance. And this time, Africa walks that path together.